Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your podcast co-host. This week, we present a special recording of a recent dinner that PRI held in Los Angeles, featuring some top thinkers discussing conservatism, past, present, and future, as we kick off the celebration of America's 250th birthday. For those of you who weren't able to attend in person, you'll get the opportunity to hear from these great thinkers on the enduring legacy and future direction of American conservatism as we mark the semiquincentennial of the United States. You'll have the opportunity to hear from Charles Kesler, the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, professor, recipient of the 2018 Bradley Prize, and of course the husband of our Sally Pipes. You'll have the opportunity to hear from Matt Continetti, who is the Patrick and Charlie Neal Chair in American Prosperity at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's the author of the most recent book, The Right, the 100-Year War for American Conservatism. And we're also pleased to hear the thoughts of PRI Fellow Stephen Hayward, who's a visiting professor of energy and environmental policy at Pepperdine. We hope you'll find this presentation to be an interesting one and an appropriate one as we kick off our year-long celebration of America's 250th birthday. Thanks for listening.
I know it will be unexpected to hear in a forum like this the name Donald Trump. But nonetheless, I'm going to raise that name and ask, what? What is going on? Donald Trump is the central figure of this political age. And not only in America, I mean, all around the world, politics turns about around Trump's opinions, Trump's passions, Trump's prejudices, Trump's enterprises, and his enthusiasms. And how did that happen? That's sort of the question I want to raise. This is not a question, unfortunately, that American political science has a lot to say about. American political science lost interest in Donald Trump the moment he came down that escalator in the Trump building in 2015, before the first race in 2016. And they have been, as a movement, the American political scientists have been against Trump, have been horrified by Trump, have been disgusted by Trump ever since he announced. And one of the questions which it's worth asking is why? Why has it been so unanimous that the educated, the teachers of political science, who are not the worst of the politically biased and the woke denizens of the academy, they're among the best, in fact, the more moderate. We're not talking sociologists here. We're not talking literary critics. We're talking political scientists. And in general, political scientists usually think, there are sometimes more than one opinion on a question. There maybe are two parties often involved in political life. And so there's a kind of innate moderation in political science, which you don't find in a lot of other university departments, I'm afraid to say. So, but they lost interest in Trump. They never really came to ask what I would regard as the first question about Trump, which is, how does Trump understand himself? You can't really, the elementary obligation of fairness is to understand any political man, any statesman, any political actor, any theorist, anyone who writes about politics, and try to understand them as they understand themselves. Then if you wish to disagree with them, if you criticize them, that's all fair game. But if you don't do the elementary due diligence to try to understand them as they understand themselves, it's not fair to try to understand them better than they understand themselves, or contrary to the way they understand themselves. And yet, American political scientists, American journalists, never made that elementary exercise of fairness. And so they have consistently misunderstood Trump because they never tried to understand Trump. I think that's, alas, the reality of our situation. But so if you ask the question, how did this man, Donald Trump, become the dominant political figure of this age. I mean, it's an enormous accomplishment. What set him up for this? How did he go about doing this? And it's a very countercultural question. He didn't do it because of his eloquence. He didn't do it because of his exemplary life. He didn't do it on the basis of his learning, much less his magnanimity. This is not Winston Churchill. We're not talking about a great man in the ordinary sense of that term in politics. I think we come closer to understanding the Trump genius if we look at him in terms which are normally applied only to liberals and to progressives in America. There's something about Trump that I think we could acknowledge. He has an ability to summarize and to concentrate the spirit of his age, to sum it up and to express it in all of its contradictions and dead ends. Hegel, admittedly a German, referred to this kind of political excellence as a world historical individual. American liberals, since Woodrow Wilson, have called this kind of genius leadership. And you know, if you go back in American politics, leadership used to be pretty much a dirty word in American politics. If you read the Federalist Papers, as I have, you will find out that the term leader or leaders is used about a dozen times, 10 of which are all pejorative. To call someone a leader in the Federalist is to say that they are a demagogue. That is to say, they are a misleader of democratic politics of the people. They are to be suspected. They are precisely the kind of people, the destroyers of Republican government, that Hegel was talking about in his list of world historical men. His list includes Alexander, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon, destroyers of Republican governments, all. But when Woodrow Wilson got a hold of this category of world historical leaders of men, leaders of the age, embodiments of the spirit of the age, he interpreted it as a virtue, as a good thing. Because as long as the leader is leading the people into the future, and the future is democratic, the future is more and more progressive, the future is guaranteed to be more and more liberating, more and more empowering. What's to object? That makes a perfect, it squares that circle, because it shows you that to be a leader is not an undemocratic thing. It's the most democratic thing of all. You're ahead of the rest of the society in leading the people into the heaven on earth that is to come. And ever since Woodrow Wilson, we have made leadership into a good quality, such that now you can't really run for any public office. You can't run for dog catcher unless you have leadership quality, unless you can demonstrate your capacity for leadership. And that means to show that you have, to use another word which is not from Woodrow Wilson, charisma, charismatic leaders. This has been a theme of the 20th century, in social science and in political history even. Charismatic leaders are those people who have an uncommon sympathy with the masses, but also a vision of the future which the masses don't have. The charismatic leader is one who can look into the future and prepare his people for the next movement towards the consummation of that future. If you know where your age is going and what it needs, then you can prepare the next step in politics. You can prepare your country for what it is ripe for, even if it doesn't know that it's ripe for it. And so one of the strange things about 20th century American politics is that it is scarred, it is characterized by these slogans about the future. The New Freedom, that was Wilson's slogan. The New Deal, of course, from the 1930s. The Fair Deal, the Great Society, the New Covenant. You may have forgotten that one. That was Clinton, Bill Clinton, he was president. The New Foundation, that was Obama's slogan for a while. but it sounded a bit too much like ladies' undergarments, so it was eventually cast aside. But nonetheless, to have a century in which you move from one sort of slogan about how beautiful the next administration is going to be, how it's going to sum up all of the latent possibilities of American politics and American society, and that the whole country was to some extent wedded to this notion that the president knows what's coming. He's preparing us for what's coming. He's kind of an Old Testament prophet, but with less interesting sin. And so, but he has that same kind of almost divine knowledge of where we're headed, and he's there to help us get there. Well, all of those, of course, are very progressive slogans, very left-wing visions of what the immediate future holds, the Great Society, obviously, and so forth. Trump obviously does not qualify as a charismatic leader because he's not a progressive. He's not a liberal. He is the equivalent of charismatic leadership if you're on the right. He's a fascist. And of course, charismatic leaders include fascists. If you translate leadership into German, it doesn't sound as good. It's the Führerprinzip. There's something about that kind of raises hackles among non-Germans and even Germans today, of course. But Trump obviously disqualifies himself as a liberal in good standing by being Donald Trump, by being the kind of political leader that he is. And as American liberals understand him or try to understand him, they think Donald Trump exists to lead America backwards in terms of our politics, our morality, even our science. And that's why you may remember Kamala Harris at the Democratic National Convention, where she was nominated and where she gave her acceptance speech, leading chants of the whole assembled throng, "We are not going back." That was her slogan. Now, that isn't a very good slogan, I admit, but it was the slogan which they chanted. We are not going back, because to go back means to be atavistic, to be a throwback, to go to a more primitive level of science, of morality, and of politics, which primitive level Trump exhibits or illustrates as far as liberals are concerned. We're not going to retreat from our democracy, to use a phrase which Joe Biden used all the time, our democracy back to the old original democracy of America as prescribed in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence. Those are old, outmoded, and immoral ideas and times. Liberals believe, and it is, once you point it out, I suppose it makes sense, but it seems strange. Liberals believe that their reforms will be permanent. There's no going back. You can't turn the clock back, to use another favorite phrase of liberals. You can only go forward. And so when they pass the New Deal, when they pass Obamacare, when they pass the latest of their reforms, the assumption in their heads is that this is it. Now, this is the new baseline. Everything will happen from this point on. We're not going to repeal Obamacare. We're not going to repeal the New Deal or the Great Society. That is an unthinkable thought. There is only the forward movement of history and politics. So Trump, to liberals, is a dangerous paradox. He seems to dominate the age, to, as I said, summarize the age, to embody politics in our age, and yet he's backward. He's heading backward. He's moving to the past, not to the future. It's okay to be a charismatic leader if you're JFK or if you're Barack Obama, but you can't be a charismatic leader if you're Donald Trump. That he could lead us backwards and is leading us backwards is almost unthinkable. Donald Trump is not supposed to be cool. And yet there was that period after the 2024 election when professional athletes and college athletes were imitating his dance move. You know, they were doing the YMCA dance as Donald Trump imagined it and realized it. And that's not supposed to happen, but it did happen. And so that is the paradox that they have to face, the terrible paradox. Now, for conservatives, Trump means something else. It's true that Mr. Trump has left behind fusionism and, you know, the sort of the political agenda to some extent of the Buckley-Reagan great days of the conservative movement in favor of something more crudely nationalist, America first, as he calls it. Yet Trump is no Charles Lindbergh isolationist. You can ask the Iranians, the Venezuelans, even the Greenlanders about this. Trump is not like his vice president, you know, J.D. Vance. Vance is more of an ideologue, if you want to use that term, that sort of ugly term, than Donald Trump is. Vance is a critic, for example, not only of our policy in Ukraine and elsewhere. I mean, Trump is to some extent too, but Vance is more consistent, I would say. But Vance is even a critic of, you know, the Declaration of Independence as the universalist roots of our propositional nation. These are new terms, I realize, ugly new terms. Propositionalism is now a noun. I'm sorry to break this news to you. But Trump is not very good at explaining himself or his policies, admittedly. But sometimes this is a great political virtue. It means you won't be attacked for being doctrinaire, but it also guarantees that his successors, his would-be Republican successors, will have to spend a lot of time defining and explaining themselves. And the fissures within the future Trump movement or Trumpist movement are, I would say, already beginning to emerge. They are already visible. There's a gap opening between what you might call the nationalists and the more conservative members of the National Conservative Coalition that Trump, in a way, represents over questions like tariffs, H-1B visas, interventionism in foreign policy, taxation, welfare, and many other things. You can begin to see that what happens when Trump leaves the scene will be a big fight about what Trumpism means. And already Republicans are choosing sides in that controversy. So are we on the verge of some kind of Republican realignment? Are Republicans about to win in American politics? It felt like that in the 2024 election. Trump did so well, Republicans did well in demographic categories that they had not done so well in a long time. I would say it seems less assured now than it did in 2024. And of course, time will tell, but the policies of the Trump administration, more than anything else, will determine, I think, the political destiny of Trump and Trumpism. Is there such a thing as Trumpism after Trump? This is one of the basic questions about our politics now. And I now will yield the podium to those who are more qualified than I to pronounce on the future of the Republican and conservative movement. So who's next? Matthew?
Join PRI February 19th, 2026 in Sacramento for our annual California Ideas in Action Conference. Every year, PRI brings together some of the top free market thinkers in the state and the country to talk about how market-based reforms can pave the way for more political balance in the state and address some of the state's nagging challenges. This year, we have some terrific speakers lined up, including one of California's top reformers, San Jose Mayor Matt Mann, as our keynote luncheon speaker. You'll also hear from chef and food entrepreneur and newly appointed Huntington Beach City Councilman Andrew Gruhl as our kickoff speaker. You'll also hear policy experts discuss how to address the state's ongoing insurance crisis, and you'll hear from some of California's top journalists and opinion writers about all things politics in 2026. So RSVP today at pacificresearch.org/events Events to guarantee your spot for probably the top free market conference in California every year, PRI's California Ideas in Action Conference, February 19th, 2026 at the Sutter Club. Go to pacificresearch.org/events to join us in Sacramento.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you all for inviting me here to speak this evening. I was telling my table last week on this occasion I was speaking to an audience in Canada. Let me tell you, being an American in a dining club in Toronto is a little bit like being Rabbi of Mecca. It's a very lonely job that I gave. Sally asked us to speak about the state of conservatism, and while I was mulling that topic over, I was reminded of one of Ronald Reagan's favorite jokes. Reagan would talk about how when Brezhnev, the Soviet premier, was asked to describe the state of the Soviet economy in one word, Brezhnev would say, good. Then when Brezhnev was asked to describe the state of the Soviet economy in 2 words, Brezhnev would say, not good. Then the title of the talk came, and it was the 3 of us were going to talk about the past, present, and future of conservatism, and I had this vision of A Christmas Carol, since we've recently left the holiday season. So I thought one of us might be the ghost of conservatism past, and another would be the ghost of conservatism present, and then finally we'd have the ghost of conservatism future. But even then, I thought that Dickensian metaphor didn't work, and really it is a tale of 2 cities, appropriately described in January of 2026. That is, it is the best of times and the worst. Start with the best of times. 10 years ago, if I were giving this talk, I would have thought you had landed from Jupiter. You told me that a decade hence, Roe v. Wade and the Bakke decision on affirmative action would be overturned by a 6-3 Republican majority on the court. Not only would taxes remain low permanently at the rate set during the first Trump term, but that the most recent tax bill would include a provision for universal school choice. If you had said that DEI and the Green New Deal were the walking wounded, I would have scoffed. If you had told me that the Iranian nuclear program was under a mountain in rubble, confirmed by the Iranian foreign minister in a recent interview, and that Nicolas Maduro would no longer be in charge of Venezuela, I thought you'd be dreaming. If you had told me that the southern border would be secure for the first time, I think, in any of our lifetimes, and that we go from the equivalent of a Dodger Stadium being released to the country every month, 60,000 people, to 1 person, I would have thought you were crazy. If you had talked about, let's see, NATO burden sharing, NATO finally paying more of their fair share, though they're cheap. You talk about the individual mandate and Obamacare being repealed, I would have scoffed. And if you had said, most importantly, I think, that 10 years hence, we would have seen the vindication of the red state model. That is, the red state conservative model of low taxes, less government, school choice, public safety, good transportation, low-cost energy in Texas, Florida, Georgia, elsewhere across this great land. Not only being vindicated in policy terms, economic growth, but literally people moving from certain states, I won't say which ones, to these red state models. I would have said that would have been a tremendous vindication of the conservative. And so I think at the level of policy, actually, conservatism is hitting its stride. It's at the level of ideas where I think conservatism has become more, as they say, problematic. And that's because, in my view, the agent of all these conservative victories, which I thank God for every night, is also responsible for weakening the conservative guardrail, for redefining conservatism, and for basically allowing different challenges to the conservative consensus that prevailed for decades. Now, what was that consensus? In a nutshell, the consensus was that economic conservatives and social or cultural conservatives had to work, that American conservatism was the marriage, the union of a belief in freedom and a belief in tradition. And that union was best expressed through America's founding document, through the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, through the institutions of the Constitution, and then through the American political tradition, which we begin reading the Federalist. I think Donald Trump has upheld the Constitution, but I also think that he has allowed critics of the Constitution, critics of the Declaration, critics of America, to kind of find a place in the new right wings. And so they go under different names, people who are critics of this union of freedom and tradition. They're called national populists. They're called national conservatives. Some are called post-liberals. Others are called common good conservatives. All of them have deep critiques of the United States of America. Now, these are appropriate intellectual critiques. They're good to debate and engage with at the level of ideas. But there's something very different than the conservative tradition of freedom that has really informed our movement for the past century. And this weakening of guardrails has also allowed, I think, flourishing of conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism in some parts of the American right. I don't want to exaggerate this problem, but we should acknowledge that these new elements are present where they had since been cabined off. I think one way of looking at this change on the right is to see the reversal of two very prominent political figures on the right. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, George W. Bush was kind of the black sheep of Republican presidents, right? He hasn't spoken at a Republican convention in over 20 years. 2004 was the last Republican convention he appeared at in person. He sent a video to the 2008. And yet, even then, I think Republicans would defend and conservatives would defend to some extent, not entirely, the Bush presidency. Whereas another figure, much more long-lived, the commentator and multi-time presidential candidate Patrick J. Buchanan, had been exiled from conservatism and the Republican Party because he sympathized with some of these critiques of the American experiment and that union of freedom and tradition I was talking about, and indeed had also, let's say, dipped his toes in anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories. And yet today, Bush, of course, is gone from the black sheep to the invisible man, right? We only see him in his paintings, his canvases. And Buchanan has been put forward as a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom by the Heritage Foundation, which was long considered the preeminent conservative think tank. Now, as an aside, I don't think Trump will reward Buchanan this way, because Buchanan, if you recall, challenged Donald Trump for the Reform Party nomination in the year 2000. And I think Trump remembers what Buchanan said about Trump at the time. But that's an example of how the conservative universe has changed to allow in perspectives that had not really been on the scene for much of my lifetime, let's say, someone who kind of grew up during the Reagan-Bush era. So if you ask me what the biggest challenge facing conservatism today is, I would say the following. American conservatism, which had relied on a balance between freedom and between liberty and culture, is now in disequilibrium. And there are large parts of our movement that are favoring the culture side, the tradition side, over the freedom side. They're preferring national tradition, national identity over equal freedom, which has always been part of it. I think you see that in some of the online discourse about so-called heritage American. I'm not sure what one is. As a Continetti, I really don't want to connect my identity as an American to having ancestors who came over here on the Mayflower. I feel pretty American, but I can't say that my ancestors came over from the Mayflower. Does that make me not a heritage American? I don't know. I think you also see this in kind of the beliefs, not only in the post-liberals, but kind of the sense that there's a blood and soil aspect. Again, of course, there's a culture here, but it has always been balanced by this belief in the equal freedom that's promised in the Declaration of Independence. And so what I think right now is that American conservatives need to have this recognition that freedom and tradition work together. That's what makes this country unique and exceptional, is this tradition of liberty, is our founding, which we are celebrating the 250th birthday of. And that this tradition of equal freedom is expressed through our political institutions that are the longest lasting democracy on the face of the planet. That is what American conservatives defend. That is our heritage, both freedom and tradition, both liberty and order. And we also always must remember that it takes two wings to fly. Thank you.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Well, okay. I think I have to pick up on something Sally said in her introduction about Pacific Research Institute being founded in San Francisco, where the Republican Party meets in a phone booth. And people would say to us, San Francisco, really? And I don't know how many of you remember now, it's a while ago now, but there was for a while, based in Marin County, this garden supply mail order place with a fancy store called Smith and Hawken. They're long gone now, I think. Somebody remember Smith and Hawken? I mean, they had a genius marketing scheme, which was they talked about how green they were. They're going to save the planet. They were organic, and therefore your little garden trowel was $75. And people would buy them like crazy. Anyway, I used to tell people, "Why are you in San Francisco?" I'd say, our mission is simple. Never mind free markets and Milton Friedman. I'd say, we are here to bring a Smith & Wesson attitude to a Smith & Hawken city. Nowadays, that makes kind of, left wing because things have only gotten worse, right? All right. Now, I also wasn't sure, our theme tonight was past, present, and future. And I thought exactly the same thing Matt did, which was the Dickens and the Ghosts of Christmas Past, Present, and Future. We never got together to talk about who would do what, but I figured since I was going last, I would do future, which suits me actually because of course, I follow the news every day and have lots of thoughts, but I also think that one of the problems of politics is that it's always a short-run matter. So we're all wondering right now, how's this Minnesota business going to play out? How's it going to go? Is there going to be a government shutdown 72 hours from now and so forth? But it's always important to try and take a long-term view, and I've always thought that's what we're best at Pacific Research and AEI, right? That's what we're best at and what we should be doing. So there's sort of three things on my mind about this. One is that while Trump is still at center stage, is exactly the time to think ahead and to look at where things are going or ought to be going, might be going, and so forth. And so the first proposition is, it is true that Trump blew everything up. Charles spoke to that, I think. I think in a good way. It was long overdue. Now here's a comparison that Matt, especially having written his capacious book on the history of the right, may or may not find felicitous, but I think in some ways Trump is a successor to Barry Goldwater, not in ideology, certainly, but in challenging and disrupting the sort of center of gravity of the Republican Party. The difference is Trump won the election, and his personal force is holding together all of the different factions that both Charles and Matt have spoken to. And once his personal force, his charisma, I explain Trump in exactly the same way Charles does. Once that's gone, then all those differences we have now are going to erupt potentially in very certainly destructive, contentious ways. Those contentiousness is already present, but imagine what it might be. It doesn't actually matter in some ways who the successor is, whether it's Rubio or J.D. Vance or someone else, right? So once his personal charisma is out of the way, we're going to have to face things. The second proposition is there are some big issues out there that right now are lost under the solar eclipse of Trump. We all kind of know what they are. The economy, going decently at the moment. Foreign policy, it's very interesting right now. What National Review 30 years ago called the national question, and boy, don't they look prescient about that now in retrospect, for saying, the question of national identity, which connects to what we think about immigration, and people thought, oh, you're a bunch of crazy people. That turned out to be way ahead of the curve. One of the things that's missing right now, I think, and it bothers me, is we don't talk as much anymore about individual freedom or free markets. But Matt and I have talked about this a bunch. I've been drawn back a lot to Frank Meyer, who I put away his books 40 years ago, and they gathered a lot of dust on my shelves, and I've dusted them off lately. Boy, do they read very fresh right now, I think. Frank Meyer, who died in 1972. And he would be he was the great fusionist. Charles mentioned the word fusion, I think. And he didn't like the term, rightly so, I think. I won't go through all the history of that right now, but he did say very emphatically that the economy should be as free as possible from any government domination. So he would be horrified at the government taking ownership stakes in so many prominent American corporations. If this was, there's two or three ways to think about this. One is the thing we should be worried about. I hope we don't see this, but what will a President Newsom do with those stakes in the company? Or just ask ourselves in this room, if this were Kamala Harris, President Harris, doing this now, I think we would be up in arms about it. We have some trust with the Trump people because we think Scott Bessent, I think, is a terrific Treasury Secretary. Lutnick, I'm not sure about, but I trust him more than I would a Kamala Harris appointee in that job. But I do think that we haven't asked that question about when you give the executive certain kinds of powers, what will the other team do with it when they get in power, which will happen inevitably. I would like to hear some old-fashioned regard for individual freedom in free markets. We expect Joe Biden to say Milton Friedman's not in charge anymore. How you like your 10% inflation, right? But it's another thing when our team says that, although most of them don't even say that because they've forgotten who Milton Friedman was. Let's say a lot more about all that. Back in the 80s, I'm so old now. Remember in the 80s, we worried a lot about the Imperial Congress because it was Congress in a lot of ways that were very problematic, interfering with President Reagan and with the rightful uses of executive power. And that contest is very alive right now. On the other hand, Congress has been so enfeebled by its own doing, mostly, that now you wish, well, if they're not going to be imperial, at least, could they at least be a good colony? That does something productive. And this is bound up with the whole question of the administrative state, long subject. I'll have to say that at one point, I guess I will do it this way. The phrase administrative state goes all the way back to the 1940s. And then in the 1980s, certain people, some of us at Claremont, a few other places, Vincent Ostrom at Indiana wrote some very good work about this. But it was an obscure phrase. And I remember some prominent libertarians in the late 80s, early 90s, I won't name names, you would recognize their names, but they'd say to me, what do you mean by administrative state? I don't get it. Does that just mean bureaucracy and regulation? And we say, not really. I mean, it does include those things, but really it's a constitutional question. And they kind of scratch their head and say, now everybody knows that phrase and understand what it means, that it's a deformation of our constitutional order. And we're making some significant progress on that. I do get frustrated with a lot of the, especially younger conservatives who say, we don't want any zombie Reaganism, and reflect that if Reagan had had today's Supreme Court, oh my goodness, there's so many initiatives Reagan took where he got stymied by the courts, including, in a few instances, the Supreme Court, which was not ready at that time for the kind of challenges that are succeeding at the court today. Matt made a point about this in a certain way. I'll just add that when I hear that, was the conservative movement ever conserved? I think of that Monty Python scene. What have the Romans ever done for us? I think most of you know that. Roads, schools, water, crime. Oh, things were terrible for the Romans. Okay, if you know the scene, you know the point I'm making about all this. The third point is, and here's where you worry a bit about Trump's brashness. I guess I'll say vulgarity at times, which doesn't bother me, but I know it bothers an awful lot of people, and I get that. Matt has a really important column today about Rahm Emanuel, or as I call him, Rombo. He's kind of got that personality. If you ever met him, I've met him a couple times. He's okay. Matt's column, if you haven't seen it, said he's the only, restoration, renewal Democrat. He's going around saying, I think the premise is Trump's not going to be on the ballot in 2028. And so if you're just obsessed with opposing Trump, that's a mistake for Democrats. I think a very practical judgment. That fits with a broader point that political scientists have thought about, which is the true test of whether a realignment is happening, Charles raised that point, is whether you compel the other party to change its orientation. The New Deal ultimately beat Republicans into submission, starting with Eisenhower. Even Reagan didn't want to challenge the New Deal. As he said in his diary, I'm not against the New Deal, I'm against the Great Society. And we're not seeing Trump so far. It took, 3 catastrophic landslide losses for Democrats to finally say by the 1990s, we need to write. Let's remember Bill Clinton says, I'm going to end welfare as we know it. I'm for the death penalty. And to prove it, I'm going to sign the death warrant for Ricky Ray Rector in Arkansas. I'm going to tell off Sister Souljah in public and attack George H.W. Bush from the right for raising taxes. It was very cynical, of course, but shrewd and effective. And so Democrats figured it out. Rahm Emanuel, working for Clinton, I think, is trying to reassemble the old Clinton team this 30 years later to one last hurrah. And so we'll see how that goes. Otherwise, you see the resistance Democrats, right? They're just hysterical about Trump. So if they're going to change, they probably need to lose 2 or 3 more elections. And we'll just see how it goes. We're 3 years away. And as I say, I think it's a mistake to right now spend a lot of time speculating about how these next 2 election cycles will go. Instead, I think we want to talk about our core ideas that are out there. And here I'll draw to a close with the theme that Sally introduced for this whole series that PRI is doing. One of you mentioned, I forget which one of you said that, DEI and the Green New Deal are back on their heels. That is true, but the ideology behind it is burrowed deep in the Democratic Party. Did you see the articles? First, the Atlantic Monthly has this article a few days ago about how Gavin Newsom will be a terrible nominee. And then the New York Times yesterday, with what's his name, Thomas Edsall, said Democrats are still in deep trouble. And he's I don't know if you've met him, he's a very nice guy, a very thoughtful guy, and he interviews people, he does the data. And this is the New York Times and the Atlantic Monthly saying, oh, you know what, Democrats are in trouble. They need to figure this out. And they're not figuring it out. They're really unpopular, more unpopular, arguably, than Trump is. And I'll just sum it up this way. They're burrowing in. They think they can reverse all this and get back to business as usual on day 1 in 2029. Or to paraphrase the famous phrase of George Wallace, it's DEI today, DEI tomorrow, DEI forever. And that is what they believe, right? So that brings me to the last point I'll make. It was Matt who flagged for me. I mean, I remembered it, but it was until Matt said to me back in November, Frank Meyer's most important essay was not one about fusionism, this clunky phrase, but it was his late essay, not long before he died in 1972, called Western Civilization, Problem of Political Freedom. And I do recommend it if you can find it. It might be online, I'm not sure. But he says the real problem we're talking about is Western civilization itself. And he gives a long synoptic account of some different parts of it. But he concludes the essay as follows. Quote him here. The establishment of a free constitution is the great achievement of America in the drama of Western civilization. The struggle for its preservation against utopian corrosion is the continuing history of the United States since its foundation. A struggle which continues to this day and which is not yet decided. Elsewhere in the essay, he explains that one of the problems is that the frustrated ambitions of the utopian left makes them more dangerous as they go on, hence the scenes in the streets of Minneapolis. And I actually think that, although of course we want to talk about, taxes and particular issues and crime and whatever, education, maybe that's the most important since education is rotten from kindergarten to the end of the university. I also think we ought to put it in terms of civilization itself. And so I'll end with this thought. I'm so old now. By the way, when I hired on PRI, I had a full head of hair. But I'm also old enough to remember the bicentennial in 1976. And one of the big spectacles then, many of you who are my age, of course, or older, remember the tall ships sailing up the Hudson with their grand rigging from the colonial eras. And the story of the Europeans coming to America, the errand into the wilderness, to use Perry Miller's famous phrase or whatever, it was something to be celebrated. I gather it's going to be repeated in New York this year as part of the national plans. But I speculated that if we had today President Kamala Harris, the July 4th celebration would feature a flotilla of slave ships going up the Hudson. I literally mean that. I think that's actually what they would do. And I wouldn't put it past Mondami to actually try and slip some in, or at least to say, I would make a wager on this, that Mondami or people like him, you give your list of, Yohanoma or whoever you want, they will say, gee, we left something out. Where are the slave ships and all this? I think that's how this debate is going to go. And so we are lucky to have the Right, semiquincentennial. It just rolls off the tongue easily, doesn't it? This is a great moment to sharpen the fact that today's left is, in that great phrase of Roger Scruton, as its core, a culture of repudiation. Repudiation not just of America, but the entire tradition of the West that brought us to this point. That's beyond tax rates and, Sally, single-payer health care, all important things, but I think we should start talking and put the left on the defensive. I agree with the people who say 10-point reform programs for this and that policy are essential and necessary and nice. That's not what's going to stir the souls of the American people. And so here it is. It's out in front of us. Let's go get it.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.